What's up, everyone? Kevin Allen here, aka the Geek from DFS Army. And today we're taking a look at the DFS Army Domination Station Optimizer NASCAR product. And this will be a tutorial on how to use the Domination Station Optimizer for NASCAR on DFS Army. So let's get right into it. Right here on screen, you see the NASCAR Optimizer is loaded on my screen. I've just actually hit reset settings so we can get like a fresh view of this. And you can see here that up top are our general options. These are the same across pretty much every daily, every sport on the Domination Station Optimizer. And I'll go through them briefly, but they don't change for the most part. These are the same options we have for every single sport. Underneath here, we have the player pool. And I'll go through that as well. The player pool includes the driver name, their starting position. We can sort by starting position if we like, or by salary if we like, but we've got our driver name, our salary, our starting position, and if they are a dominator, and when appropriate, when there are practices, you get some practice times, fantasy points per dollar, which is our value ranking, the odds of the driver winning the race, which is very, very important. Go right here, ownership projections, player projections, and here in backtest mode, we had a column called Final Fantasy Points, so you can see what actually happened in the race. So let's get into the basic settings of the Domination Station Optimizer. These are not unique for NASCAR. These are across all sports, but of course we have our salary range slider, which allows you to sort drivers or move them to excluded based on their salaries. And if I wanted to exclude all drivers below a certain salary level, I can do that here. I can just type 5,000 and boom, it will exclude any drivers under 5,000. If I slide this back over, there will be no excluded drivers. Similarly, fantasy points range, I can exclude drivers from eligibility based on their projection. So if I say, hey, I don't want any drivers projected below 20 fantasy points, I can do that. And you'll see here that it moved a bunch of these drivers into the excluded column. I think Todd Gilliland actually was in the nuts. So there you go. Sometimes maybe you want to be careful using that or being too aggressive with excluding drivers, even based on fantasy points range. Similarly, we can set a min-max salary cap. So if you want to not spend the full salary cap, if that's what you're into, then you can type 49.9 or something like that, and it will, not allow a total of 50,000, but maybe 49.9. Similarly, if you find that a lot of your lineups are leaving a lot of salary on the table, you can say, hey, I don't want any lineups below a certain amount, so 49.5 or something like that. I usually don't use this very often for any sport because the optimizer will tend to spend the total cap, assuming that unless the projections don't call for spending the whole cap, in which case I don't want them to. Continuing on, this tool right here allows us to cap the total projected ownership of any particular lineup. I'll give you an idea of the way I might use this. So what I'll do is I'll generally run, let's say, like 20 lineups with very few options, so pretty raw. And then I'll sort my results by total projected ownership. And it shows here, the highest owned lineup is 214. Percent total P owned is 214%. Generally for a cash game, that's great. We want as high total P owned as possible. They're chalky or high owned, but in tournaments, high owned tends to not win. Never, ever bother putting the top optimal in a giant tournament. It will never win, and it is just a waste of entries. That's stuff we go over all the time. So in this case, what you might do is just set a total P owned below 214%. So I'd look through and say, they're all around 200%, 190, 192 for the top 20. So I might set a cap here of 190. And these are things that you might, as a user, figure out on your own by using the backtest functionality. Go back to previous races, see what works for you. Here you set the number of lineups you're going to make. This is an interesting tool that allows you to force at least X number of drivers under X percent ownership. So again, another tool for kind of making sure your lineups aren't overly chalky. You could say, hey, I want to force at least 2 drivers under 15% owned in each lineup if you so choose. This toggle here forces the tool to prioritize completing lineups above your min-max exposure. So let's say you're one of these people who never watch any sort of tutorials and think that you can set a min of 20% and a max of 30% on every driver and let it rip. Generally, that will not work. Can't make lineups like that. It doesn't work at all. There's no reason to ever do this. Don't do this ever. Don't set mins on every single player. It's not possible, because you're basically creating a request that is impossible to fulfill. But if I have prioritize checked, it'll make the 20 lineups. It's not going to follow these rules. It's just going to start to ignore them, but it will get as close to your request as it possibly can. So that's why that rule is there. But don't be shocked when you see Briscoe here 40% owned, even though you have a 30% cap on him. If we didn't have any cap on him or didn't do this min-max, these guys would be 100% owned. So, never do this is what I'm saying. Don't set a min and a max on every single player. Especially don't set a min on every player, and never set a min and a max on the same player. There's absolutely no reason or no time or reason where that should ever be done. Okay, so those are some of the basics. And now let's get into some of the specifics for NASCAR. So the primary, NASCAR doesn't have a lot of stacking like certain other sports do. The only real uniqueness to NASCAR is each race might have a different number of dominators. What is a dominator? A dominator is a driver with the potential to dominate the race. On DraftKings and FanDuel, the way their scoring works, but much more DraftKings, but FanDuel as well, drivers are getting bonus points for lead laps, meaning being in first place, not finishing in first. You get that as well, but being in first place, lead laps. And a lot of times, drivers that are in first place are also getting fast lap points depending on the track. Now, those are things that our coaches within DFS Army will vet and discuss before every single race. So you'll know, hey, what kind of race is this? Oh, it's a 2-dominator race. It's a 1-dominator. It's a no-dominators race. So once you figure that out, here's how the setting works. Dominator stacking options. You're going to stack at least, exactly, or at most X number of dominators in every lineup, right? What is a dominator? Well, in the initial upload of the slate, our coaches, Taco, will set which drivers are dominators. And usually they're going to be the top 10 or 12 drivers, or anyone in the top 10 or 12 who has a shot at leading, not just leading laps, but dominating the race, meaning leading a bunch of laps. Certain tracks, the way scoring works, if you don't catch the dominator, the driver that is in first place and leads a bunch of laps, you will not win. And a lot of times, the optimizer is going to favor what we call place differential plays above dominators, meaning the optimizer and the projection model will always favor a driver who's really, really good, who's starting in the back. So I'll give you an example. Tyler Reddick is a $9,100 stud starting 35th, meaning he has a ton of place differential upside. So his raw projection is 60.5 fantasy points, by far the highest raw projection on the slate. Look who has the high raw projections, the guys who are starting in the rear. Those are mean projections, though. But what this doesn't account for are any of these drivers starting towards the front. Let's see what the actual finals fantasy points show on this race. And it showed that here. Here, Ross Chastain, who is a stud, but starting 8th, put up the second most number of fantasy points on the slate, because Ross Chastain dominated. So if we had a rule in place that said at least one dominator, then it would have forced at least one of the top 10 drivers into your lineup. And in this case, Ross Chastain would have been that guy. And so the idea with the rules on the optimizer are to create lineups that look like tournament winning lineups. Now, we as a user have the ability to control who counts as a dominator. So right here, you can toggle yes or no to each driver. So let's say you don't like the default. You say, hey, Ricky's not really a dominator. I'll set him as no. And let's say I want to use one. We want to make sure we have at least one dominator in every lineup. So I'd go through this and say, hey, is Chris Buescher a dominator? Probably not. Is Dinger a dominator? No. I might put a couple of no's in there, and I might even throw a yes on like a Denny Hamlin and include him in that mix. So with stack at least one dominator on, you'll have at least one of these drivers with a Y, a yes to dominator in every single lineup. You could also do at most or exactly one, which means it will only use one and not more than one. So those are things that differ based on track type, just how it sets up each week. And our coaches will kind of go over what we feel is the best approach for dominators. If you wanted further rule creation, we can use the player combination rule to create, like, one of our favorite rules at DFS Army is the one shitter rule. Meaning, let's say there are a bunch of drivers here that are kind of projected poorly, and usually those guys will be the lowest projected ownership guys, right? So you might find, let's say, these drivers that are projected really, really low. They're in bad spots like Yelly, where Corey LaJoie, McLeod on this slate, Busher, all of this group, like all of these guys that are kind of projected below 10%, Alex Bowman. And maybe I want to force some exposure, like, hey, they're going to be low owned. And what happens if, for example, Suarez happens to sort of hang out and finish and be in the nuts? And he actually had a very good score at very, very low ownership in this particular race. So we might say, hey, I'm going to force, these are where you want to force a little min exposure. You won't get exposure to these types of drivers generally, but you might force a little bit of exposure here to some of these, what we call shitters, meaning drivers in bad spots that still could win, but not very likely to, right? And you could force a little bit of min exposure, but let's say I don't want more than one of them in the same lineup together. So I'll allow one of these, but not two in a lineup, right? So then you could create what's called a separate rule that says, hell, okay, we did McLeod, Stenhouse, what was it? Suarez, Gilliland, and Dinger. Right, and so we make a no shitter rule, meaning stack between 0 and 1 of all of these drivers in all lineups, which will effectively limit. It won't force one of them in every lineup, but it will make sure you never get more than one of them in any particular lineup. So there's a lot of customization available. You can make a number of these types of rules if you want. If you want to kind of make a bunch of lineups built around manufacturers like the Toyota cars or or the Fords or teams, maybe it's you want to like Trackhouse or JGR, whatever it is, you can make rules to suit your approach and to customize lineups in a way that you are happy with. Let me get rid of those now. One other really cool feature of the Domination Station, one of my favorite features that we have is the backtest mode. So we're in backtest mode right now as I'm recording this. There's not a current slate, so I'm going back to the slate that just passed recently. And backtest mode is really, really important for you to use because this is where you can test different approaches, different settings, and figure out what works for you. What is an approach? Do you want to fade the chalk? Do you want to go really, really light? First of all, we can go back and see what won. So that's the easiest thing. So if I optimize by Final Fantasy points here, the first lineup that pops up, and now I sort by Final Fantasy points, here's the winning lineup for this one, and it scored a 363.85 fantasy score at 131% total projected ownership. So really interesting, right? Really interesting in the sense that the total P owned was really kind of low, 131%. Second best lineup, 120. So it looks like on this slate, fade the chalk. And now in backtest mode, what I can do is run a bunch of, I would go back to the projection model. I might run this again and sort by Final Fantasy points. And what was the best score we produced? Oh man, it's only getting a 216 with no adjustment. All right, so you can test different theories out. Do I want to use the shitters? Do I want to force it? Let's try it like that. What if I force at least 2 players under 15%? Does my result get better? All right, got a little better, 252. So we can do a lot of different things like that to test strategies, and you can go back and see pretty much every slate that's ever happened. So if there's a Daytona happening at a plate race, well, we can go back and back test some of the previous plate races to see what happens, to see what won, and it helps your approach going forward. So without getting too deep into back testing, it's really, really important to use that functionality. It's something unique to DFS Army that other optimizers simply don't have. And it's what I believe gives our players the biggest advantage in terms of winning tournaments and taking down tournaments and understanding the types of settings that you need to use to attack these different contest types. Now, when you're comfortable with the lineups that you've created, you've optimized, you made a run, you like it, you're going to hit download right here. You're going to save your lineups and go to the tutorial that shows how to edit lineups on FanDuel or DraftKings. I very much prefer reserving my lineups in advance, so I'll reserve 150. And then when I'm done with the optimizer, and I've run 150 lineups, let's do 150 here, and I've run 150 lineups that I like, I will edit them into my current reserve lineups. It only takes a second to edit 150 lineups. So make sure you're doing that and not trying to manually type in these lineups. That's ridiculous. We have a tutorial for it. So make sure you've seen that tutorial. If you have a problem, ask us in the Discord and we will help you. And that's about it. That does it for NASCAR. That's how I use the NASCAR optimizer in 2023. This optimizer has produced win after win after win after win after win after win after win. Helmets over helmets constantly. So I think NASCAR is one of our best sports. Again, rely on the NASCAR staff to understand, how many dominators we need in a particular race. Should we have dominators? Who to target? Who the cores are? All that good stuff. And then work your personal customizations into the optimizer and win some tournaments. Good luck this season, everybody. I'll see you at the top of the leaderboards.